So let's get started this morning. We've talked the last few weeks about the character traits that a godly woman possesses in order to create an environment in our home where change can take place and where we can be the hands and feet of Christ in our homes and in our lives and in our relationships. So we've actually addressed 8 character traits so far, and I'm going to do a brief review of what we've gone over before we get started because I want us to really get this. You know, we talked about a few weeks ago that so many times in our lives and in our relationship, we are looking at what the other person in that relationship is doing and what their faults are and what their weaknesses are and what their shortcomings are and how they could be better, but we rarely take a look inward at ourselves and say, what is my part that I'm playing in this relationship? And when I started this series, I never intended for it to end up quite like this, but I love the way God has scripted this message because really you can't control how the other person in your relationship behaves or how that person acts, but you have control over you. And by being a picture of Jesus Christ in your relationships, you can and will see the changes that you're hoping for take place, and it will pull you up into a place of joy in being all that Christ has died to give you. So the first thing that we said is that she's a Christian and that she acts like it. She's teachable, she's not defensive, that she is kind at all times, lighthearted and easily amused, and that she's positive. Now, last week we talked about the fact that not only is she those things, but that she is also servant-hearted. And what we said, we used Jesus as the example at the Passover feast, and we talked about the fact that when Judas was about to betray him, and that Jesus knew it, he did not look at Judas and say, now come here, Judas. You know, I know what you're about to do. You get out of here. I'm not about to wash your feet. Yet Jesus knew that he was about to betray him, and yet he still washed his feet. He was pouring out himself until the very end. No matter what was given to him, he returned evil with good. And we said that the way that you overcome evil is to do good and to be good and to be Christ-like in all things. We also said that the characteristics of a godly woman is one who exhibits being led by the Spirit and not by her emotions. We talked about the fact that women are very emotional beings, that God created us that way and that it's something to be embraced. But at the same time, God created men. For the most part, they are much more logical beings. And that if we'll work together with our spouses, we can gain and grow from one another. I made the point that you don't have to be in bondage to unruly emotions, that Christ died to set you free from even that. The word says that he whom the Son sets free is free indeed, and that he didn't stop with just emotions, that he meant in every area of your life that you could be free. I used the scripture from Psalms 91:1, which says, he who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide, which means to remain stable and fixed under the shadow of the Almighty. We also said that a woman who is a godly woman and portrays godly characteristics in her home is intentional in all of her doing. That good marriages don't just fall into place, that good marriages are built. We talked about ways that you could build and be intentional in your relationships by doing things like coming to this type of women's Bible study, by getting a hold of books on how to have good relationships, by being intentional, by listening to podcasts, by listening to sermons, by going to marriage counseling, by seeking wise counsel, and all of those things. This week, we are going to continue the trend, and we are going to talk about one more godly characteristic that a woman portrays in her home who wants to exhibit Christ-like character. And this is one that we are going to be talking about, and we're going to barely bite into it today. We are going to move on to it again next week, and we're going to kind of camp here next week as well, because it's something that I believe relationships rise and fall on the type of communicator you are. So, what habits does a wholehearted, healthy woman portray in her relationships? She is a good communicator. She is a good communicator. And I want to remind you and start by saying that there is no such thing as a perfect marriage, that there aren't perfect people, and that no matter what people look like that you see around you, they are not without fault. That no matter what you see on the outside, no relationship is without struggle, that no relationship is without differences in opinions, and no relationship is without conflict. It is not the absence of conflict in a relationship that creates for a good relationship. It is actually the way that we manage the conflicts in our relationships that create for a good relationship. And I think some people tend to not really get that. They think, well, if I can just keep from fighting with my spouse, or if we can just make him more like me, if he would just do things the way that I want him to do them, then we wouldn't have this conflict and we would have a great relationship. But that, my friends, is a lie. You cannot have a perfect relationship. There is no man and woman alike that are going to think the same way in every situation. There is going to be conflict. It is not whether or not you have the conflict in your marriage, but it is how you manage the conflict that will create for a good relationship. Now, I told you at the beginning of the series that I would rate my marriage on a scale from 0 to 10 at about a 9.5 to a 10. And I just want to say again that it's not because we're perfect. My husband and I realized very quickly that conflict was inevitable. Our very first fight happened a few months after we were married, and it was over a Snickers bar. Do you know that people are getting divorced today over Snickers bars? It is the all goodness truth. I put a Snickers bar in his stocking because he loves Snickers bars, and it sat there for about 2 or 3 months. We were living out in Missouri, and it was a really cold, blustery day. There was snow on the ground, and I couldn't go out in it because I wasn't used to driving in snow, nor did I want to. And I had nothing sweet in the house, and I thought, aha, my husband has a Snickers bar. And granted, I gave it to him, but it's been sitting there for 2 months, and he hasn't eaten it. So I went in and I said, hey, honey, can I have that Snickers bar? And he goes, oh man, that sounds great. You know what? I think I'm gonna eat it. And I looked at him and I thought, what? And I said, all right, well, split it with me. He goes, I'll give you a bite. What? You're going to give me a bite? Yes, you're going to give me, he will tell you to this day that I was an Indian giver and that he was right. We won't even go there. Nonetheless, he ended up splitting it with me. But people get in conflict over stuff like that, really silly, really ridiculous things. They might be being selfish. I'm not saying that he was, but they might be being selfish, or they might be, just, not in the right place in their mind. And so we do these things, and our humanness comes out, because that's what happens when you put 2 people in a room together and you say, okay, now go at it, do life, right? So it's not whether or not we have a conflict, it's how we manage the conflict. So those of you out here who are thinking maybe that other person that you're in a relationship with, the spouse that you're married to, the mother-in-law that you have, you don't go thinking that you have to get rid of the spouse or get rid of the mother-in-law or get rid of the kid just because you have a conflict, because your problem is not your spouse. Your problem is learning how to manage the conflict. And once you learn how to manage the conflict in a godly way, you will begin to see the change take place. And, God's got great things for you. So this morning we're going to talk about how to communicate effectively. Proverbs 15:28 says, the heart of the righteous studies how to answer, but the mouth of the wicked pours forth evil. So this morning we are going to study how to communicate effectively. I'm going to read that again. Proverbs 15:28. The heart of the righteous studies how to answer. Do you know that there are not just people who are born better communicators than others, that everybody has the potential to be able to communicate effectively? It's just that some work harder at learning how to do it correctly than others. If you want to get good at something, what do? You practice, right? If you want to get good at baseball, you practice baseball. If you want to get good at gymnastics, you practice gymnastics. If you want to get good at cooking, you better pick up a pot and a pan and some ingredients and put something together, because you're never going to get good at it if you don't practice. The same thing holds true with communication. If you want to get good at it, you are going to have to study how to communicate effectively. You cannot keep doing the same things over and over and over again in your relationships and expect to have different results. You've got to learn how to communicate effectively. Mark 4:24 says, and he said to him, be careful what you are hearing. The measure of thought and study you give to the truth that you hear will be the measure of virtue and knowledge that comes back to you. And more besides will be given to you who hear. See, you get out what you put in every situation in life. you are going to get out of it what you put in. If you sit here this morning and you listen to this series on building healthy relationships and you go home and you do nothing about it, nothing is going to change. But if you will study the Word of God, if you will listen and re-listen to the messages in the morning, if you will get out books, if you will really contemplate and think and examine your relationships, and you will see what is working, what isn't working, how can I be better at communicating my point, how can I do a better job of saying what I need to say, then you will see the results. Because what you put in is what you're going to get out. So this morning we're going to be talking about what I call absolutes. And they are things that there is absolutely no excuse for ever doing them when you're communicating. And I really wanted to be able to go into a lot more, but honestly, when I wrote this part out, it was just so much information that I thought we're going to have to stop here because I don't want to run you an hour and 15 minutes like I did last week. So I'm going to try to keep this to about 45 minutes so you don't get bored and don't want to fall asleep in here. But we are going to be talking about absolutes, and they are things that you absolutely have to make up your mind before you get into any relationship, or make up your mind today once you're already in it, that I am never going to do these things again. Now, are you going to fail sometimes? Yes, because failure is part of growth. You cannot expect to do everything perfectly just because you heard a message on building a healthy relationship. You are going to fail, and if you set yourself up to think that you're going to hear this message, you're going to go home, and you're going to be able to be perfect, then you're going to quit and give up. If you will not quit, if you will not give up, if you will stay focused, you will keep your goal in front of you, you will run towards the vision, you will see the vision come to pass in your life. So, the first absolute we're going to talk about is never yell to communicate your point. Sounds pretty harsh, I know. Never yell to communicate your point. You will never have a healthy relationship if you cannot learn how to control the level at which you speak to those people who you are in relationship with. Ecclesiastes 9:17 says, the quiet words of the wise are more effective than the ranting of a king of fools. The quiet words of the wise are more effective than the ranting of a king of fools. Before I ever got married, I made a decision, my husband and I made a decision that we would not be a couple who yells at each other. Do you know that when you yell at your spouse, you are tearing them down? It does not build a healthy relationship. So my husband and I made this decision, and I cannot say that we were perfect or that we have been perfect. But I want to tell you this, and I don't tell this to very many people because I don't ever want somebody to look at me and think, well, wow, they just have something special that I don't have. But my husband and I, in 13 years, have yelled at each other one time. One time, and that's it. So you ask, can it be done? Maybe not perfectly, but pretty close. If you will make up your mind ahead of time that yelling is something that is unexcusable, and that you cannot get a clear point across to your husband or to your best friend or to your brother without, I don't know what I just said. If you will make up your mind not to yell, you will have a whole lot better chance of not yelling. But if you don't ever go into it, if you don't go in with a plan, you are not going to get anywhere. You're going to end up yelling, you're going to end up screaming, you're going to end up in a fighting match, and yelling at your spouse or yelling at your friend does not get you anywhere. So you have got to make up your mind before the conflict starts that there is no longer going to be yelling in your house. And you know what? It's as easy as a decision that you make today. You can make that decision right now, and you can see a change in your household this instant today. Because it's really hard for somebody to yell at somebody who won't yell back. You know, if you're constantly yelling back and you're constantly engaging and fighting, and they're screaming at you and you're screaming at them and they're screaming at you and you're screaming back, number one, nobody's hearing anything that the other person is saying. Number two, that other person can never look inward at themselves because they can always point their finger back at you and say, aha, you get out of control and it makes me get out of control. But if you will make up your mind that